Well, I'm kind of lazy today to record a very long tutorial series, so I figure I'm going to bore you guys with a bunch of more facts about the distant light and background, and show you a bunch of cool things you can do with them without any external resources. To begin, let's get rid of our background and distant light here. So I just deleted my distant light and my background, and as a result of which my map looks really boring. To make it look awesome again, let's start by adding a distant light, and I'm going to show you a few ways you can do this. If you remember from a previous tutorial I made, I showed you guys that you can easily position your distant light if you enter view from target and then simply use the escape key and navigate to move the view, but at the same time you're also moving the flashlight or any entity you're viewing from. And if we pretend that this little ball here, the probe light, is the sun, so pretend that there's a background here, and this is the place of the background where you'll see a sun from, I can easily position my distant light to match that if I make it so that when I view from the entity, the sun location is at the center of the screen, exit, and then from tools, add 180 to its pitch value. So in my case this will be 226. And you can see that my light now accurately matches the shadows a sun located here would have cast. And this is a useful way if you have a custom background. But wait, hold on a bit. Never mind. So this is a good way to position your flashlight if you have a custom background with a light. But there is another way, and this time we are going to use something called the Sun Locator. So just forget about these values, let's reset them to 0. And from the entity panel, add something called a Sun Locator. And what this does is pretty much allow you to import a geological location, a time of day and month, time of day, and it will calculate where the sun would be located given those parameters. To have this work, first you need to set a target, and the target is pretty much, well, think of the target as the center of the earth. So in our case, the most central terrain is this one, and its center is the exact center of the map. So to assign this terrain as a target, I'm going to highlight the target entity, then hold down Control Alt and left mouse button click on the entity I want to point this value to, in my case the terrain. And now that I've clicked on it, you're going to see that the name of the entity is displayed here, and my distant light has disappeared. You can use position center view on selection or A key to find it. And now if I adjust any of these values, you're going to see that it accurately moves around. So I'm moving the hour slider, and I have a pretty nice sort of sun up, sunrise, sundown effect. To finalize things, I'm going to enable selection ranges and then increase the distance from targets so that my flashlight is pretty reasonably far away, and use Control and Shift to stretch out the shadow box, this orange box here, and this pretty much tells it where to apply shadows. So as you can see, my shadow box is here and there are shadows, but if I shrink it, you're going to notice that objects outside of the shadow box no longer cast shadows. So let's stretch it out to, like, I don't know, 500 should do. You should be mindful not to stretch your shadow box too large, because the fidelity of the shadows is related to how big your shadow box is. So for example, if I, as you can see, I have this reasonably detailed shadow of the flag, but if I stretch the shadow box to let's say 7,000. You're going to see that if I move out, the shadows aren't even calculated, because the resolution would have to be too great. Only the closest nearest buffer is used, but any shadows that are too far away get highly distorted. And this is usually because you have your shadow box set to be too large. So let's return it back to a small value. Anyhow, back to the Sun Locator. As you can see, now I can simulate sunrises and sundown by moving the hour slider. And for example, I can play around with this and say that I want this map to be located somewhere like 43 by 10 latitude and longitude. Or you can use Google Earth to find your own latitude and longitude and input those degrees values here. These are in degrees. So this is a pretty cool way to set up your terrain and light. So I showed you how to create a reasonable procedural sun. Let's just increase the brightness a bit, like so, using the Sun Locator. Now I'm going to show you another very awesome thing that Grow Team made, and this is called the Skylight generator. From geometry, add a cube background, and let's place this, well, keep it here for now, because you're going to need to target the sun. So if you remember how we originally targeted the sun, if I can find it anywhere, wait, where is it? If you lose any entity, you can press N to bring out a list of every single entity in your map, find the name, in our case distant light, and then double click that, and then simply use the A key to find it. So in our case, select the background and from sun, target your, well, sun. And you need to do this to tell the Skylight generator where to use a, well, you get the idea, you tell it where the sun is. Now that we've set that up, let's locate the background somewhere underground, like -1,000. And we place this somewhere underground because sometimes you're going to get an error that an entity is trying to be rendered in both foreground and background. And it's usually a good practice to try to have as little errors in your map as possible. And one way to do that is to place your background on a very distant level. So, very simple mechanics. Target your sun, create a new Skylight generator by clicking on the None, New Skylight Generator, and simply press either Shift or Control. Control and B, Shift and B, Shift and B, and you're going to generate yourself a sky. How cool is that? SedIT comes with its own jargon. If we go into numpad 6, you're going to see that we have some sky, but it's way too bright. I'm not sure why it generates this brightly, but you can modulate that. If you adjust the modulator color, simply click on this, the third box, and drag down to reduce the brightness. And ta-da! This is a procedurally generated sky texture in SedIT. You get to have some settings, for example, chirpability, and this means pretty much how dense the air is. So if we want to have some mountain area, mountain background, we can use a lower value. Holy shit! Okay, so we can't use a lower value. Oh, we can. Wait. So apparently if you use a decimal, it doesn't seem to work very well. But anyhow, if we want to have a very rare atmosphere, lower the value. And if we want a denser, more industrial atmosphere, you can increase it, like 4. And you can see that the fumes and pollution haze thing starts to increase. The default value is 2, and the larger you get, the more darker and more polluted it will look. This is a very good way to create dramatic sunsets, and I'm going to show you that later. So let's set this to like 4, and every time I click this, I simply use Shift and B to give back the sky texture. It takes some tweaking, and there we go. And this is purely dynamic. If I go back to my distant light and then create some sort of a sunset, like go down really like so, and return to my background if I can find it and bake it, you're going to see that it accurately simulates a sunset. So this is kind of really cool. It even generates colors depending on what your sun or what your durability is. But you're going to have to play around with this, adjust the colors a bit, and you can get some pretty nice results. Okay, so I showed you how to use the Skylight generator and Sun Locator, and now let's tweak them a bit. So where's my sun? I want to create some sort of sunrise. So I'm going to decrease the time. Don't place it beneath the horizon because, well, you don't get to have any shadows then. Well, something like this. It looks pretty nice. We have these long shadows. Now let's decrease the color and make it more orangey because of the redshift effect of the atmosphere. You can adjust these values by just clicking on the boxes and dragging. And the first one is hue, aka color, saturation, and value. And the value is a very mysterious thing I'm going to create a tutorial about later. But for now, remember, try to keep it around 1 or 3 at most. Because otherwise you're going to get some HDR problems. I should really get to that tutorial eventually, but not now. I'm making a sunrise. Yay! So some tweaking. Like so. Get back to my background. Bake it. Adjust the colors. This usually takes a lot of tweaking, so maybe more durability. This looks kind of cool. Some decrease or increase. And now I can finally bake the probe light. And even if you've watched my previous tutorial, you're going to know what this is. And I'm going to eventually create a special dedicated tutorial about probe lights because they're a science of their own. So here we have a pretty nice sort of sunrisey, sunsetty. I only know that it's sunrise because of the time I set, but it might as well be a sundown. The final thing we might want to do is add a haze from effects, haze. Position it at the center of my world, but it doesn't really matter where you place it. No, it does, but in my map, since it's a very large open space, it's a good idea to have it in the center. Doesn't matter how big it is, it will always work. And now I'm going to adjust the directions which are open by default, or if they're not, expand them. And adjust the color. Make it somehow orangey, more saturated. Increase the start distance so that we can actually see a bit of the map. we want to lower density, usually works better on open space maps, just gives a more spacey effect instead of a more claustrophobic. And we can control the background altitude. This is how much of the haze is applied to the background. Usually somewhere like so to create a nice blend. Adjust the altitude. We don't want a too high one, so that we can get some nice shapes and silhouettes on the background. And this doesn't look good. Alright, hold on, I'm going to be right back. There we go, this looks kind of cool. We have these nice colors in the background, you know, contrasts and complementary colors, and it just creates an overall nice feeling to the map. We can do a few more things, like add a sun flare, you know, those sun reflections you see if you go through our cube background, and add a simple form effects flare. And the actual flare entity is this small white sphere, so just place it somewhere, blindly try to adjust it to where your background is. I don't know if you can see what I'm doing, it's so small. Now if we return to our overworld and go to full render mode, we can start to create our little flare configuration. I'm going for my own one because the core team ones won't really work for a sunset or sunrise. So to create your own flare, go to None, and instead of Browse, go to New, see Flare Configuration, and just start adding parts. For textures, you can find some nice ones in the contents here, some free textures, effects, and go to flares. And let's make the first one be our glow effect for the sun. So scroll down until you find one that you like. I don't know what I'm going for, let's say this thing. And you're going to see that your texture is now being projected as a flare. We can do more interesting things than a simple dot in the sky. Increase its size, change the color to something more orangey. Like so. And now we can add a few more ones. And these are going to be our fancy reflection halos and stuff. And if you control the offset, you're going to see what I mean. Let's say an offset of 4. And this pretty much means that when I pan my camera, the texture flare is going to move like, well, those movie flares do. So this too requires some tweaking, and I'm going to be back when I get to something nice looking. A few options that are worth mentioning are the aspect ratio. This pretty much controls the stretching of the flare or making it really short. The initial rotation and rotation factor. This pretty much means how the flare rotates depending on where I'm looking at. So if I place this at 0, it's always going to be rotated the same way. And if I use something like 100, I get this nice rotation if I move my camera around from the initial flare entity. So you can get some cool effects like this. The initial rotation is pretty much the default value of the rotation of the end effect. So if you have something So if you have a more complex texture, you can use these two values to adjust it to realistically simulate lens flare effects. Light amplification simply makes it more bright or dark, and the other are pretty self-explanatory, except light desaturation, and I'm not exactly sure what this does. And fade by intensity is pretty much how the effect fades away when you move around. If the flare entity wasn't in the background. Ta-da! Awesome lens flare effects. I use the rotation value to adjust the large ring texture so that it rotates accurately, and the aspect ratio to make the sun lines, these ones here. So this is pretty much everything there is to say about creating procedural backgrounds. You can also add a cloud particle effect, but I'm going to go into that in a later tutorial. For now, experiment with creating your own backgrounds and stuff, and I'm going to see you in other tutorials. Ones that I hopefully won't be digressing as much as I did in this one. Yes, I know about that, but can't help it. Have fun, and I'll see you later.